Welcome to a story history tried to silence. Tonight, we uncover the buried truth of Kafele Nzinga, an Angolan slave whose suffering was so brutal it was erased from records and whispered away for generations. As you listen, tell me in the comments where you're watching from, because stories like this connect us across borders and time. And if you value carefully researched, fact-checked history that takes real effort to uncover, subscribe now. Your support keeps these forgotten truths alive. Before his capture, Kafele Nzinga lived in what is now Angola, a land shaped by powerful kingdoms, deep traditions, and complex social structures long before European domination. Communities were organized around extended families, agriculture, ironwork, trade routes, and spiritual belief systems that connected the living to their ancestors. Life was not primitive or chaotic, as later colonial narratives falsely claimed, but structured, purposeful, and rooted in identity. Names carried lineage, history, and honor. Nzinga itself linked him to a proud cultural heritage that would later be deliberately stripped away. Kafele grew up surrounded by oral history, where elders passed down lessons through stories rather than books. These stories taught courage, loyalty, and survival, preparing young people for adulthood in a world that demanded resilience. Music, rhythm, and ceremony were not entertainment alone, but memory itself, preserving history in a time before written records were widespread. Kafele learned who he was through these rituals, long before chains would try to redefine him as property. Daily life revolved around the land. Farming, fishing, and regional trade sustained villages, while local markets connected different ethnic groups across wide distances. Contrary to later myths, many Angolan societies were politically sophisticated, with leaders, councils, and laws. Kafele was not born into helplessness, he was born into a functioning world where he had a role, responsibilities, and a future imagined by those around him. Yet this world was already under threat. Portuguese traders had been active along the Angolan coast for generations, exploiting internal conflicts and fueling violence through firearms and incentives. Raids became more frequent, trust between neighboring groups weakened, and fear slowly crept into daily life. Even inland communities like Kafele's were no longer safe from a trade that treated human beings as cargo. Rumors traveled faster than armies, stories of people taken in the night, never to return, of ships that swallowed men and women whole. Parents warned children, villages kept night watches, and escape plans were whispered but rarely effective. The terror of capture was not abstract. It was a looming presence that reshaped behavior and sleep itself. Kafele grew up knowing freedom was fragile. Despite this, life continued. Love, celebration, and hope still existed, because surrendering to fear meant surrendering identity. Kafele likely dreamed of adulthood within his community, of family status, contribution, never imagining that his name, language, and past would soon be declared meaningless by foreign hands. When capture finally came, it did not just end a life phase, it severed an entire world. Everything Kafele was before that moment, his homeland, his people, his meaning, would be deliberately erased. Understanding who he was before the chains is essential, because it proves a truth history tried to hide. He was not born a slave, he was made one. The moment of Kafele Nzinga's capture was sudden and violent, the kind designed to leave no room for resistance. Raids often took place before dawn, when villages were still asleep and confusion could be weaponized. Armed men stormed homes, setting fires or killing those who tried to flee, ensuring panic spread faster than any warning. In the chaos, families were torn apart, and survival became a matter of chance rather than strength. Kafele was likely bound alongside others with ropes or iron restraints, forced to march for days toward the coast. Those who collapsed from exhaustion were beaten or left behind to die, their bodies serving as silent warnings to the rest. Food was scarce, water controlled, and the march itself was meant to break both body and spirit. Each step farther from home made escape less possible and hope thinner. Along the routes, captives passed through makeshift holding camps, where traders inspected them like livestock. Age, teeth, muscle, and scars were examined without shame, reducing human lives to potential profit. Names were ignored or replaced with numbers, an early step in erasing identity. For Kafele, this was the first time he was treated not as a person, but as an object to be sold. The coastal forts were worse. Packed into dark, airless dungeons, captives waited weeks or even months for ships to arrive. Disease spread rapidly, fueled by filth, hunger, and despair. Cries echoed through stone walls, but no mercy answered. The ocean nearby, once a symbol of trade and travel, became a terrifying boundary between the known world and an unimaginable future. When the slave ship finally arrived, terror reached its peak. People were branded, shackled, and forced aboard under the threat of death. The stench of the ship, blood, waste, and decay, announced what awaited them below deck. Kafele was chained in positions that allowed barely any movement, surrounded by strangers who shared his fear, but not his language. The middle passage was not a journey, but an endurance of calculated suffering. Heat, darkness, and disease killed many before land was ever sighted again. Some captives resisted by refusing food or attempting rebellion, but punishment was swift and brutal. Survival often depended on silence and endurance rather than strength. By the time the ship reached its destination, Kafele Nzinga was no longer seen as a man from Angola, but as cargo that had survived transport. His forced enslavement was complete, marked not only by physical chains, but by the systematic destruction of identity. What followed would be even worse, but the journey itself had already stolen everything he once was. The erasure of Kafele Nzinga's name began almost immediately after his forced enslavement, because names were power, and power was the one thing enslavers could not allow. Upon arrival, African names were mocked, mispronounced, or dismissed as meaningless sounds. Slave traders and owners understood that a name carried memory, lineage, and humanity, so stripping it away was an intentional act of domination, not convenience. Kafele's original name linked him to his ancestors, his homeland, and a living history passed down through generations. In Angolan societies, names often reflected circumstances of birth, family honor, or spiritual meaning. To erase that name was to sever him from everyone who had ever known him, ensuring that even if he survived, he would do so as someone unrecognizable to himself. He was likely assigned a new name, often biblical, European, or deliberately degrading, chosen without consent and enforced through violence. Failure to respond to it could result in beatings or worse. Over time, survival demanded compliance, forcing Kafele to answer to a name that denied his past every time it was spoken. This daily repetition was psychological conditioning, meant to reshape identity from within. Language followed the same path as names. Speaking his native tongue may have been punished, pushing him into silence or broken communication. Without shared language, enslaved people were isolated from one another, unable to organize, mourn, or remember collectively. For Kafele, each forgotten word was another piece of himself slipping away. Records reinforced this erasure. Plantation logs and sales documents reduced individuals to age, gender, and price, rarely recording origins or real names. On paper, Kafele became a number, an entry, a transaction. History itself was rewritten to exclude his voice, making future generations believe he never existed beyond ownership. Even memory became dangerous. To remember one's true name was to remember freedom, and freedom was considered rebellion. Enslavers relied on exhaustion, fear, and repetition to wear memories down. Over years, some captives struggled to recall the sound of their own names, not because they chose to forget, but because remembering hurt too much. Yet erasure was never total. Even if Kafele could no longer speak his name aloud, it lived silently within him, a private act of resistance. The attempt to destroy his identity reveals a deeper truth. Enslavers feared who he was before the chains, and the fact that history tried to bury his name proves it still carried power. Life on the plantation was built on cruelty by design, not accident. From the moment Kafele Nzinga arrived, he was forced into a system where suffering was routine and mercy was treated as weakness. Work began before sunrise and ended only when darkness made labor impossible. Exhaustion was not a side effect, it was a tool used to keep enslaved people too tired to resist, think, or remember who they once were. The labor itself was relentless. Whether in fields, mills, or workshops, the tasks demanded speed and obedience rather than skill or safety. Mistakes, real or imagined, were punished immediately. Overseers enforced rules through fear, making examples of individuals to control the many. For Kafele, every day carried the risk of violence, not because he failed, but because cruelty needed no justification. Food was deliberately inadequate. Rations were barely enough to survive, ensuring constant hunger that weakened bodies and minds alike. Clean water was scarce, medical care almost non-existent. Illness was treated as laziness, and injuries were ignored unless they threatened productivity. The message was clear: his value existed only in what his body could produce. Sleep offered little relief. Enslaved people were crowded into cramped quarters with poor ventilation and no privacy. Nights were filled with pain, whispered grief, and the quiet fear of being summoned for punishment. For Kafele, even rest was unsafe, as control extended into every hour of existence. Physical punishment was public and calculated. Whippings, restraints, and other brutal measures were used to enforce obedience and terrorize witnesses. These acts were meant to break spirit as much as flesh, teaching everyone that resistance carried unbearable consequences. The cruelty was not hidden. It was displayed to normalize violence and erase compassion. Psychological abuse ran just as deep. Enslavers used humiliation, threats, and forced separation of families to maintain control. Promises were broken intentionally, hope manipulated, and then crushed. Kafele learned that trust could be weaponized against him, making isolation another form of punishment. Over time, plantation cruelty reshaped reality itself. Pain became routine, injustice predictable, and survival an act of constant endurance. Yet even within this system, Kafele's continued existence was a quiet defiance. The cruelty tried to reduce him to nothing, but the fact that his story still demands to be told proves it never fully succeeded. Physical punishment was one of the most visible tools used to control Kafele Nzinga and others like him, serving as a constant reminder that their bodies were no longer their own. Violence was woven into daily life, not reserved for extreme cases, but applied routinely to enforce obedience. Even minor actions, working too slowly, looking away, or failing to understand an order, could provoke severe consequences. The unpredictability of punishment kept fear alive at all times. Whippings were among the most common forms of discipline, carried out publicly to ensure maximum psychological impact. The goal was not only to hurt the individual, but to terrify everyone watching. Overseers understood that pain witnessed could be as effective as pain felt. For Kafele, each punishment inflicted on others became a warning etched into memory, reinforcing silence and submission. Restraints were also widely used. Iron shackles, stocks, and confinement limited movement and stripped away dignity. Being restrained for hours or days caused lasting damage, both physical and mental. These methods were designed to humiliate as much as to harm, reducing a human being to an object on display. Survival meant enduring this degradation without protest. Punishments often ignored the limits of the human body. Infections, untreated wounds, and permanent injuries were common results. Yet those responsible rarely showed concern, because suffering itself was part of the system's logic. Pain was considered productive if it increased fear, regardless of long-term consequences. Kafele's body became a battleground where control was constantly reasserted. Violence was also used selectively to crush leadership or resistance. Those who showed strength, intelligence, or influence among others were punished more harshly. This tactic ensured that natural leaders were broken first, preventing unity. If Kafele ever spoke out or helped others, he would have been marked as dangerous simply for refusing to disappear. Children and elders were not spared. Punishment did not follow moral boundaries, it followed economic ones. Anyone capable of labor was subject to violence, and anyone who could no longer work was treated as expendable. Witnessing this taught a cruel lesson: value was measured only in usefulness, never in humanity. Over time, repeated punishment changed how pain was experienced. Fear became internalized, and obedience became a survival instinct. Yet even under constant violence, endurance itself became a form of resistance. Every day Kafele survived was proof that brutality could damage the body, but never fully erase the human will behind it. Psychological terror was as damaging as physical violence, and often more effective in maintaining control over Kafele Nzinga's life. Enslavers understood that breaking the mind ensured obedience even when no overseer was present. Fear was carefully cultivated through unpredictability, never knowing when punishment would come or what form it would take. This constant tension kept the enslaved in a state of alert exhaustion, where thinking beyond survival became almost impossible. One of the most powerful tools was uncertainty. Promises of lighter work, family reunification, or freedom were sometimes offered, only to be deliberately broken. This cycle of hope, followed by betrayal, trained Kafele not to trust kindness or mercy. Emotional manipulation became a weapon, teaching him that hope itself could be dangerous. Isolation deepened the terror. Enslaved people were often separated by language, origin, or assigned tasks to prevent strong bonds from forming. Communication was discouraged or punished, creating loneliness even in crowded spaces. For Kafele, being surrounded by people yet feeling utterly alone intensified the sense of abandonment and loss. Public humiliation played a key role in psychological control. Being mocked, degraded, or accused falsely in front of others stripped away dignity and reinforced power hierarchies. These acts taught submission without a single blow. Shame became internalized, making people police their own behavior to avoid attention. Sleep deprivation and constant surveillance further eroded mental strength. Night offered no true rest, only brief escape filled with anxiety. The fear of being watched, even when alone, conditioned obedience. Over time, this created a prison within the mind, where control existed even without chains. Threats against loved ones were especially cruel. The possibility of family members being sold, beaten, or killed was used to enforce compliance. This weaponized love itself, forcing impossible choices between personal survival and the safety of others. For Kafele, caring deeply became a source of vulnerability. Despite this relentless psychological assault, terror never fully succeeded in destroying identity. Memory, even fragmented, became resistance. Silent endurance, private thoughts, and the refusal to forget who he once was allowed Kafele to survive mentally as well as physically. The system aimed to erase him from the inside, but it never fully won. The official records that documented Kafele Nzinga's existence were deliberately incomplete, distorted, or erased, a tactic that ensured his suffering could be denied long after it occurred. Plantation ledgers focused on numbers, purchases, losses, productivity, rather than lives. When Kafele appeared on paper, it was only as property, stripped of origin, family, and voice. History was not merely written to ignore him. It was engineered to silence him. Many records were intentionally vague. Ages were estimated, names misspelled or replaced, and African origins lumped into generic labels. This lack of detail was not accidental. It made individuals interchangeable and untraceable. For Kafele, this meant that even survival offered no guarantee of remembrance. Without precise records, his story could be dismissed as rumor rather than fact. When abuses occurred, they were rarely recorded honestly. Injuries, deaths, and punishments were explained away as illness, disobedience, or accident. Enslavers protected themselves by shaping the written narrative, ensuring accountability vanished on the page. The truth of what happened to Kafele existed only in memory, not in documents recognized by authority. Witnesses who might have spoken were often silenced by fear or lack of power. Enslaved people were forbidden to testify, while poor whites or overseers had incentives to stay quiet. Speaking the truth could mean losing work, status, or life. As a result, broken records became a shield behind which cruelty could hide safely. Over time, documents were lost, destroyed, or selectively preserved. Fires, neglect, and deliberate purges erased evidence that might challenge accepted history. What remained favored owners, traders, and institutions, not the people they exploited. Kafele's absence from archives was later used as proof that his suffering was exaggerated or never happened at all. This absence had lasting consequences. Historians relying solely on written records often repeated the silence, unintentionally reinforcing the lie that individual enslaved lives were unknowable or insignificant. The lack of documentation became another form of violence, denying Kafele the dignity of historical presence. Yet broken records do not mean a broken truth. Oral histories, patterns of abuse, and surviving fragments reveal what official documents tried to conceal. The gaps themselves speak volumes. Kafele Nzinga's story survives precisely because those silences are now being questioned, and because history is finally being asked who it chose to forget. Those who witnessed the cruelty inflicted on Kafele Nzinga were often forced into silence, not because they lacked words, but because speaking them carried deadly consequences. Enslaved people who saw punishment, abuse, or death understood that telling the truth could make them the next target. Fear was contagious, spreading through plantations faster than any order, teaching everyone that survival depended on what they did not say. Enslavers actively discouraged testimony. Any attempt to speak about mistreatment was dismissed as lies, exaggeration, or rebellion. The word of an enslaved person held no legal or social weight, making truth powerless in the face of authority. For Kafele, this meant that even when suffering was witnessed by many, it officially never happened. Overseers and lower-ranking whites were also trapped in this silence. Some participated willingly, others reluctantly, but few dared to object. Questioning brutality risked punishment, loss of employment, or social exclusion. Silence became the price of belonging, and complicity was rewarded. In this way, an entire system learned to look away. Religion and law were twisted to reinforce this silence. Sermons preached obedience, while laws criminalized resistance and limited communication. Moral responsibility was shifted upward or outward, allowing individuals to excuse themselves by claiming they were only following rules. This collective denial created a culture where cruelty could exist in plain sight without acknowledgement. Family separation intensified the silence. When loved ones could be sold away at any moment, speaking out became a gamble with unbearable stakes. Threats against children, partners, or parents ensured compliance more effectively than chains. For Kafele, protecting others may have meant swallowing his own truth. Even after emancipation, silence often continued. Formerly enslaved people faced retaliation, poverty, and disbelief if they spoke about past abuse. Trauma made memories painful to revisit, and society showed little interest in hearing them. The world moved on, eager to forget what had been done in its name. Yet silence was never consent. It was survival under impossible conditions. The fact that Kafele Nzinga's story can be reconstructed at all is evidence that not every voice was lost. Each recovered detail challenges the quiet, enforced by fear, and proves that even when witnesses were silenced, the truth was only delayed, not destroyed. Survival itself became a form of resistance for Kafele Nzinga, even when open defiance was impossible. Simply enduring day after day in a system designed to destroy him required strength and strategy. Resistance did not always look like rebellion. More often, it was quiet, calculated, and invisible to those in power. Staying alive meant learning when to bend, when to endure, and when to preserve energy for another day. Small acts carried enormous meaning. Holding on to memories of home, repeating one's true name silently, or sharing fragments of language with others were ways of refusing total erasure. These actions were dangerous if discovered, yet they sustained identity. For Kafele, remembering who he was before enslavement was a way to resist becoming what the system demanded, a thing without past or future. Community, even under constant threat, was another form of resistance. Enslaved people found ways to support one another through shared labor, quiet warnings, and mutual care during illness. These bonds challenged the isolation imposed by enslavers. For Kafele, helping others survive may have been one of the few ways to reclaim agency in a world that denied it. Work itself could be resisted subtly. Slowing pace, feigning illness, or making small mistakes were risky but meaningful acts. Though punishable, these actions asserted control over one's body, however limited. Resistance here was not about victory, but about refusing to fully surrender will and intention. Spiritual survival also played a role. Prayer, song, and belief, whether African, adapted, or newly formed, offered strength where physical power failed. These practices created inner space beyond reach of overseers. For Kafele, faith may have been less about doctrine and more about hope, the belief that suffering was not the end of his story. Some resistance was simply emotional, choosing not to internalize hatred, refusing to believe the lies spoken about one's worth, or protecting empathy in a cruel environment required immense courage. The system relied on turning victims against themselves. Kafele's ability to endure without losing all compassion was a quiet defiance. In the end, survival resistance did not overturn the system, but it exposed its failure. The fact that Kafele Nzinga lived, remembered, and left traces of his humanity means the system never fully conquered him. His endurance stands as proof that even in the most controlled environments, the human spirit finds ways to resist being erased. Colonial complicity was the foundation that allowed Kafele Nzinga's suffering to exist and continue without consequence. European powers did not merely benefit from slavery, they organized, regulated, and protected it through law, trade agreements, and military force. What happened to Kafele was not the act of a few cruel individuals, but the result of an entire system designed to extract profit from human lives. Governments issued licenses, collected taxes, and enforced contracts tied directly to the slave trade. Ports, forts, and ships were funded or protected by colonial authorities, turning human trafficking into an official enterprise. Kafele's capture, transport, and sale were all made possible by this machinery. Without state support, the brutality he endured could not have operated at such scale or efficiency. Colonial courts played a critical role in maintaining this system. Laws defined enslaved people as property, removing their right to testify, defend themselves, or seek justice. Violence against them was rarely punished, while resistance was criminalized. For Kafele, this meant there was no legal path to protection, only punishment for survival. Religious institutions often reinforced colonial power rather than challenging it. Some leaders justified enslavement through selective readings of scripture, framing suffering as divinely ordered or morally corrective. This spiritual approval helped ease consciences and silence doubts. Faith, which might have offered refuge, was instead used to legitimize Kafele's oppression. Economic dependence deepened complicity. Entire colonial economies were built on enslaved labor, from plantations to shipping industries. Merchants, insurers, and investors far removed from the violence still profited from it. Though they never met Kafele, their wealth was tied directly to his pain. Education and propaganda shaped how this system was remembered. Colonial narratives portrayed slavery as necessary, civilizing, or benign, erasing the lived reality of brutality. These stories entered textbooks and public memory, ensuring future generations questioned the victims rather than the system. Kafele's suffering was buried beneath language designed to excuse it. Colonial complicity did not end with abolition. It echoed through silence and denial. By refusing to fully confront their role, institutions allowed stories like Kafele Nzinga's to fade into obscurity. Exposing this complicity is essential because it shifts blame from individuals to the structures that made cruelty ordinary and profitable. The historical cover-up surrounding Kafele Nzinga was not a single act of forgetting, but a long process of deliberate omission and distortion. After slavery began to decline, societies that had benefited from it worked to reshape the narrative, emphasizing progress while minimizing accountability. Acknowledging the full truth would have meant admitting that wealth, power, and institutions were built on extreme cruelty. It was easier to bury stories like Kafele's than to confront them. Official histories focused on dates, laws, and prominent figures, leaving out the lived experiences of the enslaved. When slavery was mentioned, it was often softened, described as harsh but necessary, cruel but distant. Individual suffering was treated as irrelevant detail. In this version of history, Kafele did not fit. His pain disrupted the comfort of abstraction. Archives reflected this bias. Documents that exposed abuse were ignored, mislabeled, or excluded from preservation, while records favorable to owners were carefully maintained. What survived shaped academic study for generations. The absence of Kafele's voice was later mistaken for evidence that such stories could not be verified, reinforcing the silence. Education systems played a powerful role in sustaining the cover-up. Textbooks avoided graphic realities, framing slavery as an unfortunate chapter rather than a defining crime. Students learned about economies and politics, not broken bodies and stolen identities. This selective teaching ensured that empathy was never fully engaged. Public memory followed the same pattern. Monuments honored colonizers and traders, while memorials to the enslaved were rare or symbolic. The imbalance sent a clear message about whose lives were considered worthy of remembrance. Kafele's story, like many others, was excluded from public space and national identity. Even when formerly enslaved people or their descendants spoke out, their accounts were dismissed as emotional, biased, or exaggerated. Academic objectivity was often used as a shield to avoid moral responsibility. The demand for impossible levels of proof became another way to deny lived truth. Uncovering Kafele Nzinga's story challenges this historical cover-up. Each recovered detail disrupts a carefully constructed silence and forces a reckoning with what was hidden. The act of telling his story now is not just remembrance, it is correction, restoring truth to a history that worked hard to erase it. The legacy of pain left by Kafele Nzinga's life did not end with his suffering. It echoed forward through generations, shaped by the same violence and silence. Trauma did not disappear when chains were removed. It settled into families, communities, and memories, passed down in fragments and behaviors rather than written words. The damage inflicted on one life multiplied across time, affecting people who would never know his name but lived with the consequences. This legacy appeared in broken family lines, lost languages, and cultural gaps that could never be fully repaired. Descendants of the enslaved inherited unanswered questions about origin and identity, while descendants of enslavers inherited wealth without truth. Kafele's erased history became part of a wider wound, where absence itself was a form of inheritance. Psychological pain persisted long after physical freedom. Fear, mistrust of authority, and internalized beliefs about worth were shaped by generations of dehumanization. These patterns were not personal failures, but survival adaptations formed under oppression. Kafele's endurance became a silent blueprint for surviving injustice in worlds that still refused to listen. The legacy of pain also influenced how societies remember or avoid remembering the past. By failing to fully acknowledge stories like Kafele's, nations carried unresolved guilt and denial. This avoidance distorted modern discussions of race, inequality, and justice, disconnecting present realities from their historical roots. Yet within this legacy exists resilience. The survival of culture, music, faith, and collective memory among descendants of the enslaved stands as evidence that pain did not erase humanity. What Kafele was denied in life, recognition, dignity, truth, his legacy demands in death. Remembering becomes an act of restoration. Modern efforts to uncover hidden histories challenge the weight of inherited silence. Scholars, storytellers, and communities are piecing together what was deliberately scattered. Each reclaimed story weakens the power of the past to control the present. Kafele's name, once buried, now carries meaning again. The true legacy of Kafele Nzinga is not only suffering, it is accountability. His story forces history to answer for what it tried to hide and reminds the present that forgetting is a choice. By remembering him, the legacy of pain is transformed into a legacy of truth, ensuring that what was buried is never buried again.